Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you to Vlad for starting to introduce what I guess is our perspective on creativity and co-creation of value. This is the paper that we're going to present is what happens when you put in the same room a cognitive psychologist, a social and cultural psychologist, and a linguist. So it all goes weird, and then it results in this. So be indulgent. Now, this is an ambitious process that we started trying to understand how does value get created. What we'll argue, this is not a spoiler, but this is kind of the end result that we got to, is that creativity is what creates value for consumers. And let us start with an example, which is about coffee. So when we try to understand where and how does value come from, we were trying to look at something that was very routine, which is, every day we go and get our cup of coffee. So what kind of value do we get derived from this experience? Well, first of all, we have many ways, and consumers have many ways in which they kind of create a new experience every time they go for a coffee. So the kind of coffee that, for instance, they would go for. When do they buy it? When do they choose to buy it? Do they choose to buy it before a presentation, after a presentation? What time of the day? Then, who serves it? Is the waiter or the waitress attractive, not attractive? How does she interact with us? Is it just like a pure commercial transaction, or is there something else going on? But also who we share, who we, decide to share it with. Do we decide to share it on our own? Do we decide to share it with colleagues, with friends, and so on? So in sum, what we're arguing is that consumers consistently make this their own. And basically this results in individual value creation processes. So the question really is, here is, to what extent do all these little choices constitute different processes of value creation? So value, if we go back to what value is about, in our coffee example, you've got an economic value. So that's the company side, right? Consumers pay for coffee, that's money, that's the kind of essence of value according to economists. But actually, this is not the only type of value that the company will get. If a consumer walks down the street with a branded Starbucks mug, that actually creates value for the company as well. And similarly, value for the consumers is not just a simple cup of coffee, but there is maybe more to it. So it can be the physiological comfort derived from the warm coffee, if it's in the winter. It can be the memories it conjures up. When I presented this paper on the ANZMAC conference in Auckland, New Zealand, after the presentation, one of the members from the audience say, "I met my husband around a coffee." So for her, every time she had a coffee, it was something special. She was still with her husband, but it was very, very much something that brings up good memories in this case, but who knows what lives bring us. Then it's also about, again, the social experience, interacting with people. It's about status and identity, if we walk up with an expensive coffee mug or brand of coffee, and so on. So just to summarize, at every point, consumers have a choice to actively recreate a different experience. So we consistently switch back from routine to creation, which is one of the points we're making here. So advancing to the key questions that we're addressing here. It's answering calls from scholars that basically have been asking how exactly is value created. So you've got a quite extensive literature. We've been talking about resource integration, internalization, externalization, and Marie will come back on this. But actually, when we discuss and started discussing with Vlad, what we realized is that there was something that was a very simple, in a way, process that everyone can do from a very early age on, and that's the notion of creativity. And we believe, and what we do in this paper, is that if you look at the literature on creativity, how do we come to be creative? This actually is very similar to what scholars in marketing have been looking at when they were trying to understand how value is created.
So our claim, which is probably fairly provocative to some, but I think in this room we're probably not too far from what most people are starting to think, is that creativity is actually, consumption is creativity through and through. So any act of consumption is in fact an act of creativity, or possibly several acts, several what we call mini acts of creativity. So anytime we consume, we are in fact being creative. So again, as Ben just said, it's not about choice. We argue that consumer creativity actually creates value. In other words, what we are calling resource integration, taking external resources, internalizing them in order to create value, is an act of creativity through and through. So our argument unfolds in 3 steps. The first one is, as I said, every act of consumption has some degree of creativity. Creativity is actually a resource integrating process that produces value in consumption. So as we integrate, we create value, and that is a creative act. And the nature of this elusive process can be clarified by using a socio-cultural framework of creativity, and that's where we introduce Vlad's work. So the value created in the coffee example it results from a number of creative actions by the consumer, selecting the cafe and the brand, crafting the interaction with the service employee. Are you in a grouchy mood? Are you going to, demand your coffee, or are you going to, have a much more, pleasant interaction, which will add more value to both the service employee and to you? Designing your own coffee. I mean, obviously, the flavor, the amount of sugar, and so on. Sipping the coffee from a ceramic mug or from a paper cup. All of these acts of creativity, which make that consumption act. Whoops, I went way too far here. Creative and valuable in itself. So what we're really using here is this notion of little c creativity, what's been called the little c creativity, as opposed to what Vlad introduced, the Vasco da Gama, genius type of creativity, the big C creativity. And we find that most of the research on consumer creativity in the literature does not address nearly the full extent of what we believe creativity, how much creativity there is in consumption. So what we're working on is really moving from the individual level of creativity, that's consumption of a cup of coffee, all the way to socio-cultural aspects of creativity. And Vygotsky talked about creativity as an act of internalization and externalization. Well, I think we are showing that the resource integration aspects of value creation and consumption are themselves internalization and externalization. Do you want to take a second?
Yeah, I can. I don't know if I have the... Okay, can I talk from you? Yeah. Okay. So just briefly, apparently I have obviously more slides, but the integrated model that is down there, and it's a very simple framework that articulates, as I mentioned before, actors, audiences, new artifacts. Creative action is positioned within the dynamic of these, and they all exist within a frame of material and sociocultural affordances. I wouldn't want to just go through all of these, because I think we talked a little bit about them, but I wanted to mention something about what Marie said, the radicalness of maybe this type of thinking, because as Maureen mentioned, very often we tend to dichotomize creativity into little c creativity and big C creativity. But that has 2 consequences. On the one hand, we lose sight of what is in the middle of this continuum. And I would argue, we would all argue, I think, that acts of creativity that have this mini quality and might not be observable can be, and that's the temporal nature of the creative act I mentioned earlier, can be transformed and lead to more and more, let's say, consequences, visible consequences. So it is misleading to just call something mini creativity or big C creativity and not notice that the way in which in time it develops, or maybe it disappears. I mean, that there is there are all kinds of processes. And second, what I wanted to mention is that what I'm trying to do with this framework and we're trying to think through is the fact that the elements that contribute to the creative act are similar in the case of mini C, if you want, or big C creativity. There is always an actor, there are multiple audiences, there is action going on, or creative action that articulates these two. There are artifacts being produced that can be material or symbolic, and they exist within a field of constraints. And if we move to the other slide, So here we have, if we want to put this model into the discussion we just have, the actor can be the consumer, but as I said, we can turn this model around and see the brand as an actor that performs an action, in our case consumption. The artifact is the specific cup of coffee that consumer creates for himself or herself. The value produced is a kind of artifact and experience through the act of consumption. The crafting of the coffee involves a series of affordances and actions. The properties of the coffee cup and the brand, the representation, the symbolic meaning, they all afford a certain kind of usage of coffee. And here is where actually creativity can take place in the process Marie mentioned of internalizing and externalizing, making the act of consumption personal and then making it social in ways that other people notice, see, and pick up and maybe transform in time as well. So this was my...
That's back to
Ben.
Thank you, Vlad. That's you.
No, that's yours.
Oh, that's mine. Okay. Yes. Okay. So in summary, I think we're sort of repeating the same thing. Consumers as actors create experiences in their inherent value, which are the artifacts, through their consumption, creative actions, exploiting the properties of the brand, and that's the idea of affordance that Vlad has introduced, in interaction with other stakeholders, their audience. And again, that shift between the audience and the actor role is important here. This obviously has implications in terms of current research, particularly in service-dominant logic, on resource integration, and we're working in that area. The 5A model and. Do you want to do?
Yeah, so we believe we have a series of interesting contributions in a wide range, actually, of disciplines. I mean, we address consumer creativity from a purely psychological point of view, but also obviously in the literature, in the consumer research literature. But it's also interesting for the kind of service research area. So we're looking at research on resource integration, the SDL framework, consumer integration, and also consumer experience in a service delivery. And one of the immediate managerial implications of this is if creativity creates value, please, companies, allow consumers to be creative, because this will increase the value they get from your products or your services. So 3 tenets to conclude. We believe that all acts of consumption are creative, even toilet paper. We've got an example on that we can discuss. We believe that consumers create value by internalizing and externalizing social knowledge and meaning, and we actually believe that this internalization and externalization processes, previously known as resource integration, are actually act of human creativity. Thank you very much.
Any questions? Yes.
Thank you for this presentation. I thought it was very interesting. I was just wondering, since in creativity you have both usefulness and novelty, I was wondering how this model, I mean, where is the novelty? That was my question, basically. How do you express it, or how do you describe it in the paper?
Right. So the novelty is, every situation is unique. A unique, consumer in a unique context with unique affordances and so on and so forth. So by definition, it's novel because it's unique. And just to sort of go to the next step, since I assume you're going to ask about usefulness, we think of usefulness as relevance to that particular consumer. Obviously, the consumer is creating something that is going to be relevant to their need, and that's how value is created. So that's a usefulness dimension.
I had no difficulties about usefulness.
Right, more the novelty. Right. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that, or I think I'm probably terribly dim, because it seems to me that actually you were making the stronger point that rather than all acts of consumption of creative acts, it seems to me that you were really saying that all creative acts are acts of consumption. So when you mentioned dominant logic, it really made me think that there's something here about commodity fetishism here. That if I leave the lights on, I'm doing something more creative than if I'm singing a song, because I'm producing an artifact. seems to me that your notion of creativity is really centered on artifacts and on consumption.
Yep.
So there's something, you know, hugely kind of neoliberal and ideological about this notion of creativity.
Yeah, I think there's a great connection between consumption. I think we never thought about reversing it, but of course we can do that. But about communication as well, because the creative act is a communicative act in a way. It's bringing something outside, say, from the person in a relationship. And yeah, I think that's a great avenue to think about that.
And by the way, also I firmly believe that any act of communication is an act of creativity, because we're crafting, you know, utterances or statements in order to have an impact on a given audience. That in itself is an act of creativity. Other questions? Eric?
I think when you move to a kind of flat ontological model, like the model you present there, you can no longer defend the distinction that you're drawing between actors and these objects. Because in my way of thinking, affordance is nothing more than a synonym for action. And you have also in this model kind of you present the actors as an unproblematic natural category. But of course, people are created as moral subjects.
Right.
That is, the person who buys a cup of coffee is already built with the intentionality into him or her as well. It is exactly the same way as the coffee itself. So I don't think you can really defend 5 poles because they really collapse into just 2.
That's an interesting
But I guess
point,
they interact. I mean, you know, the audience shapes what the actor can do and vice versa.
Well, I think the main idea of this model is to look at the relationships instead of the 5 A's themselves. I mean, maybe I wasn't very clear about that. Because I think sometimes you need, in looking at a phenomena, you need a certain analytical focus, and relationships are hard to focus on unless you have these categories to look for. But that's a broader discussion that, of course, we can...
Or could you possibly think that, you know, these different roles are exchanged over, you know, in any given situation, that the actor can actually become the affordance, you know, can become the actor. And so if they could sort of switch around, would that make it...
I just don't see why you need to reify human beings and objects as if they were natural categories, when in fact they are all constituted moral subjects.
You're not necessarily thinking of them as natural categories, are you?
I think... I justify the distinction between actors and the rest of the elements. Yeah, well, in this type of thinking, my thinking is that objects can be actors of creativity, and I completely agree with you that we should construct these frameworks, but also be very, you know, questioning in terms of how contained they are. And the idea behind distribution is precisely that there are no clear boundaries between these elements. So it is the interaction between them that hopefully we're going to study. But it's definitely a good reflection point. Why do we even need the notion of actor, and what does that imply? Yeah. I think it goes back to, yeah, again, an old way of thinking about creativity in a way. Yeah.
Marcos?
We understand why you need these categories.
Me personally.
Well, the group.
Okay.
We can appreciate why you need those categories, but why we need them as a form of explanation or as a doorway in terms of raising questions is another matter.
Okay. Marcos?
I mean, I guess, you know, just maybe the concluding point, it just highlights the fact that, you know, all these categories are interacting, but I think we need, as Vlad was saying, we need to first of all put them and set them apart before actually collapsing them, and I think that's what it helps us to do. And also realize that the whole process is a process that requires different parts, even if they can result to being, at the end of the day, much of a muchness.
But you'd still need to be able to characterize the relationships between, you know, even if you're not talking about categories, don't you? No, Eric says no, you don't need it. Okay.
Characterize the relationships.
Right. Okay. So between different entities that may be playing some sort of a role. Sorry, Marcos. It's great stuff, though. Thank you. Yeah.
I was just wondering, the notion or the concept of creativity, where in your thinking are the boundaries of that? Where does it end? So what is not creativity?
That's right.
I think that's a philosophical question, because indeed what this presentation does is extend the boundaries of creativity to a point where all human action is actually creative. And by the way, to go back a little bit to the previous question, which was very interesting, the idea of reifying different categories, I think what we share is the idea that creativity within this framework is embedded within action. It is the action that we want to study or refer to as creativity, not the actor or the audience. We just see it within this system. But I have, well, a few ideas about what is non-creative based on ideas about creativity and difference. They're, for instance, yeah, if you want an example about self and other, for instance, being instrumental for creativity, and the idea of difference of perspective between self and other, we can think, or object and symbol, we can think about the dictionary as being an effort, maybe, of collapsing that difference, of making us think the same about one object. So that could be kind of an attempt or an effort to reduce that diversity or difference or gap, because in a way, what produces creativity, or the engine of creativity, is the difference between all these elements that is being negotiated by the relationships between them. It's a bit complicated. I know it's kind of maybe a short time to explain that, but if you guys have any other examples.
I think we'll send you to the review of general psychology that discusses the 5A framework, and there is a reference on one of the slides, and we're happy to discuss it during the break.